Geez, the traffic was bad on the way down here this morning. With the rain, it was. I have a few staff that work at VACCHO who travel from Ballarat, commute into Collingwood, and now I feel their pain. Anyways, but can I say thank you very much for that acknowledgement. I do appreciate it. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I'm speaking to you today, in particular the Welcome to Country from Kelly and that emotional around health and chronic illness and the work that the health systems do for people. But I also would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the first people of this country, no matter where we are in Australia, and we are on lands that it would never ceded. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. You know who I am. I am the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, VACCHO. I've been there 27 years this year. So I didn't start out as the CEO, by the way. I started out in the Sexy Health program. That was interesting, by the way. But prior to that, I worked in Aboriginal heritage in state government in protecting what heritage our mobs have in Victoria in trying to protect it. But getting back to VACCHO, VACCHO is a peak representative body for health and wellbeing in the state of Victoria, and we support 34 Aboriginal community-controlled organisations who are all service providers right across the state of Victoria, and who they provide services to, and the current the current population data is that there's currently 79,000 Aboriginal people living in Victoria right across the state. But it is my pleasure to be here and to have this little chat with you and talk to you about also the first innovators and researchers in this country and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Research and innovation have long been integral components to our cultures right across this continent. Over 30,000 years ago, our ancestors walked this country when there was a land bridge that existed between Tasmania and the mainland. They witnessed volcanoes erupting at a place not far from here, Tower Hill, down in Western Victoria. And our people actually hunted megafauna with stone tools and spears. And I don't mean T-Rex either, I mean giant kangaroos and wombats and wallabies. Now, I also need to point out that, that these dinosaurs roamed this land almost 40,000 years ago. And if you've ever been to the Hillsville Sanctuary, if you haven't, please do in recent times, down at the Hillsville Sanctuary there is a deadly little section called Mega Mob, which has replicas of some of the amazing creatures that I just spoke about. And so I'd encourage you to take your children, your family, your friends, and go and visit and have a look at that exhibition. It's quite amazing. But our communities had and still have very complex social structures. Our people knew how to use the environment because we had to for our survival. We knew about medicines, about fire and fish farming. We knew how to look after the land because it was so important prior to contact to look after the land, because the land needed to look after us. Knowledge was not recorded on paper or on the internet like they are today. Knowledge was passed down through songlines, through stories, art and ceremonies, detailing observations about geography, about the seasons, and even the social laws. How many seasons do we have in this country today? Anyone know off the top of your head? 6. In Gunditjmara country, we have 8 seasons. And I'm not going to go through all what those 8 mean. But these methods ensured that knowledge was preserved and tested over tens of thousands of years. Aboriginal people used fire stick farming, which is a sophisticated technique of controlled burning to manage the landscapes. I remember when we had the big bushfires through the Gallager, through the Grampians. And I remember going up about 12 months after the fires had been gone and done and dusted. And I've never seen a sight like that before. It was like a New York City skyline of all black boys just coming up again due to the fire. It was amazing. And this practice, which was, by the way, is now recognised as a form of ecological engineering, helping to promote new plant growth, reduce the risk of bushfires, and help to maintain great biodiversity. Approximately 40,000 years ago, my ancestors, the Gunditjmara people, researched, developed, and established one of the world's oldest and most sophisticated aquaculture systems down in Western Victoria at a place called Budgebim. Now, I would hope many of you have been there. The last major eruption of the Budgebim volcano is understood to have been over 30,000 years ago, spreading lava for 50 kilometres towards the sea and dramatically altering the areas, the waterways and the wetlands. The lava flow provided the environments necessary for my people to develop an extensive and complex aquaculture network that involved the farming and the breeding of water creatures such as fish, eels, shellfish, for various foods and various resources. Now, there are eel traps also in New South Wales. You know how the only man-made, or better say person-made in today's environment, person-made structure that you can see from the moon on planet Earth is the Great Wall of China. Apparently you can see that, not that I've been on the moon, by the way, but apparently I've been told that you can see that from space. But also the fish traps in New South Wales, you can see them from space, and they were person-made. So, and those fish traps are a lot older than the Great Wall of China. The eels and the fish traps yield enough food to sustain many families for an entire year, contributing to flourishing and healthy communities. The traps facilitated trade between local communities, provided currency for interactions with other clans. We knew how to read the land to ensure we had plenty, not just for us either, but for generations to come. That's the important part. We also knew how to read the animals and use to enable us to plan for the seasons. There's this, I don't know how many of you know this, I don't know whether Wadawurrung know this, but when I was growing up, my mum, we lived a lot down in Gunai country to follow the seasons of bean picking or potato picking or whatever picking was on offer. That was the only source of employment Aboriginal people could get back then. So, but when I was down there as a little girl, I learnt so much about the Gunai culture and cultures that that go across clans too. But I want to tell you this little story about the black swan. Now, by watching the animals, as I said just before, used to enable Aboriginal people to plan for the seasons to come. The swan, Aboriginal people down there used to watch, prior to contact, how high the black swan built their nests. If they built their nests very high above water level, then they knew, the clans down there knew that there was going to be a lot of rain in the season coming up. If they built them low, they knew there wasn't going to be a lot of rain. So that watching the animals is a very important part of our ecosystem back then, how we managed the lands. And apart from nice eating, by the way, but the black swans forecasted so many floods that a lot of Aboriginal people knew what to do, whether to go high ground or stay low. In many regions, especially the Gunai-Kurnai country in eastern Victoria, Aboriginal people would know when the black swan built their nest higher. That was one of the indications. So you see, Aboriginal people have observed animal behaviour for tens of thousands of years to help them understand and predict the seasonal changes. These observations were passed down through generations, forming valuable ecological knowledge systems that allowed Aboriginal people to live in harmony with the environment. But as you all know, over 250 years ago, our lands were invaded. And they were invaded by people who declared this continent terra nullius. And our people right across Australia were disempowered. And our ways of knowing, being and doing, our culture and our ways of life was gone. In many areas, it was lost forever, but there in many other areas it still remains today. None of this can be denied, and it's not just my say-so or oral history, it's in the recorded history of this country. But the brilliance of our 65,000 years of knowledge have often been dismissed by historians, by health professionals, and of course by researchers. And research in the very early days of Australia evolving to where we are today, for us as Aboriginal communities, it was a dirty word. There was really bad research done back then. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you the horrors of what research happened. People's bodies were stolen from graves. Heads were amputated to measure the brow ridges or whatever. So research was a dirty word in my communities here in Victoria, but it's not no more, because more and more are we evolving to have research in our hands, research that we can contribute to, if not lead. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit later on about what VACCHO's doing in this space. So it's really important. But I'm not saying that no one should be doing research on Aboriginal health or Aboriginal whatever, but it needs to be done in partnership, I believe, with the local Aboriginal community. But as many of you would know, as I've just discussed, research does have a dark history. And I'll tell you one story, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, if you're all locals from down the Western Districts, but this is true of the Germans and the Japanese back in World War II. It is true of Americans, and it is also true of research undertaken here in this country. In 1902, Museum of Victoria encouraged Victorian public the Victorian public to hand in Aboriginal human skeletal remains for the purpose of scientific research. Museum authorities conducted archaeological excavations on burial grounds and paid private landowners of Aboriginal ancestral remains to be added to their collections. And there is a known collection of Aboriginal human skeletal remains, and that's the Murray Black collection that existed here in Victoria, where George Murray Black was an amateur researcher, and he was paid to go along the Murray River and dig up all the burial grounds. And the Murray Black collection at the University of Melbourne alone comprised of over 1,600 individual Aboriginal people. Some that were only 14,000 years old, some of those remains. In the early 1980s, Jim Berg, who is a great known Gunditj Mara elder, who is still with us today, but Jim Berg worked for the Aboriginal Legal Service back in the 1980s, and he took Melbourne University to court and had their section of the Murray Black collection returned for reburials. And that was under a very old piece of legislation called the Archaeological and Aboriginal Relics Preservation Act 1972. That no longer exists, thank God. But they were returned and they were reburied. Of course, this was met with major resistance from many academia, many researchers from around the world actually. There was a political uproar and lobbying for this not to happen. And back in 1984, he decided to take the legal action and he won his court case. And on the 22nd of November, back in 1985, 38 of those ancestors were reburied in what we now know of King's Domain in Melbourne, in the Gardens. That's where Camp Sovereignty is, by the way. And I was heavily involved in the return of those human skeletal remains for reburial. The reason why we reburied them back in King's Domain is because we had no information as to where they were taken from. We were told they just came from Victoria, so that's where they were reburied. I'd also like to add another interesting fact, is that I worked at the Museum of Victoria all those years ago and lobbying for the repatriation of many of cultural items, in particular human skeletal remains. And it was when the Murray Black collection was court ordered to be returned, the museum was a depository and I worked there to help unpack and sort through all the research that had already been done. So I remember vividly, and this is a spooky story, vividly one night when I worked, who remembers the old museum? Where it used to be, where I think it's now the State Library. Well, down there they've got really cool, weird, secret dungeons, by the way. Yeah, very scary. And I was only a young woman when I first went to work there, and that's when the Murray Black collection came over. And anyways, I was working one night, unpacking the Murray Black collection down in the dark dungeons, and I had this feeling of things weren't quite right, but then I heard a didgeridoo playing. And that made me feel I'm doing the right thing. I felt that maybe I shouldn't be handling those human skeletal remains. So the Murray Black collection did go back for reburial. So colonisation and colonial research has had disastrous impacts on our people. And for our ancestors who should have been peacefully at rest, our graves were dug up, research was being done to say that we weren't a smart people. If anything, we were subhuman in the very early days. And so you can understand why, you know, in the early 70s, 80s, 90s, Aboriginal people really didn't want to know anything about research, didn't want to be involved at all. So it is, but research is important. This symposium, when I look at all the members of the Alliance and all the work that you do, when you put up the list of, that was amazing to see that research is happening outside of universities. I think that's a really good thing, and it's being controlled and delivered by your organisations at a local level. And that translation, how you change as a result of that research, the outcome of that research, I think is even more awesome. In recent decades, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have endured culturally unsafe medical research. So today my people are considered the most researched peoples in the world, and yet the vast majority of this research is still being done without us. The exclusion of Aboriginal people from education and research has meant that our voices have been silenced, drowned out or dismissed altogether. Recognising all of this, VACCHO has done a lot of work in the research sector, which led to the launch of the Victorian Aboriginal Health, Medical and Wellbeing Research Accord, which we launched in October 2023. Despite having one of Australia's best health and medical research sectors, Victoria is the only state that actually lacks Aboriginal-specific processes to ensure ethical standards in research impacting our communities do apply. In developing the Research Accord, VACCHO undertook community consultations that focused on key themes, including having a mechanism to develop more researchers who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I was very interested in the training that you talked about, how many people you've trained. That's amazing. We're not there yet. We might tap into yours. Anyways, ensuring research translates results back to communities and community organisations who were involved in the research, ensuring that there is Indigenous data governance and sovereignty, and developing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research Ethics Committee. Victoria is the only state that hasn't got that. Every other state has an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research Ethics Committee. The implementation of the Accord signified a landmark moment supporting researchers and organisations to enhance their practices and achieve ethical and self-determined Aboriginal research outcomes for Aboriginal communities in Victoria. The Accord is built on 6 principles: Aboriginal leadership, trust and equity, Aboriginal health priorities, cultural safety and humility, knowledge, equity and recognition, data governance and data sovereignty. It did become apparent, though, that numerous community conversations conducted throughout the development of the Accord, the principles are necessary and that their success depend on processes and actions to facilitate their implementation. And what I mean by that is that the Accord isn't another nice document just to sit on our shelf and gather some dust. We actually are exploring and looking to practically implement and practically develop an implementation guide. And while it includes 9 substantial actions today, I just wanted to touch on 2 of these important actions that VACCHO is currently processing in the process of implementing. One of those actions is the development of the Accord accreditation scheme. We know that we won't see sustainable improvements in research that impacts mob unless we shift the culture and the systems that exist within research and research organisations. And so that is why we are establishing the accreditation scheme. Its purpose is to bring about individual reforms that improve the ways we do research here in Victoria. The Accord accreditation scheme is being developed to support research organisations to improve the way they undertake research. The 6 standards that underpin that accreditation scheme are the principles of the Accord. The indicators for each of these standards are being reviewed by key stakeholders and will be finalised following endorsement from the Accord Governance Group, which is expected to take place this month, so we're close. We then plan to pilot the standards within research organisations in early 2026 in preparation to launch the accreditation scheme by December 2026. Another action we are working on is the establishment of the VACCHO Human Research Ethics Committee. In Australia, New South Wales, Western Australia, South Australia all have established Aboriginal-specific human ethics research committees, but we do not have one here in Victoria. So VACCHO will be also looking at how we can do that. Once launched, the committee will be the only ethics committee in Victoria dedicated to the review of Aboriginal health, medical and wellbeing research that impacts expected within community. We have appointed the membership of the VACCHO Ethics Committee, developed a comprehensive online application portal and submitted registration to the National Health and Medical Research Council. The first Human Research Ethics Committee meeting is scheduled for this month, and the official launch is planned for March 2026, which I think is really quite exciting. We've come a long way. In order to make sustainable change in a way we do research, we need all researchers to walk with us. We ourselves cannot shoulder all the responsibility to bring about change and implement ethical practices in health and wellbeing research just by ourselves. The Accord aims to help drive self-determination in Aboriginal research by empowering our communities to have a greater voice in how research is conducted across Victoria. So I'm looking forward to seeing the Accord enable more research to be conducted by Aboriginal communities for Aboriginal communities. But as we move forward, let us just listen, learn and collaborate, ensuring that the wisdom of the oldest living culture in the world is respected and is given the recognition that it deserves. We must recognise the deep, valuable knowledge systems that have sustained this land for tens of thousands of years. We must ensure that Aboriginal voices are not just heard but are truly valued. By uplifting and respecting Aboriginal research, we not only enrich our collective understanding, but we pave the way for self-determination, equity and healing. Because a future built on respect for Aboriginal knowledge is stronger, wiser and more just future for us all. The other area that VACCHO is also exploring is how do we ensure that Aboriginal people get access to clinical trials. Very few Aboriginal people are offered access to clinical trials. So we're exploring how we can improve better outcomes there. If anyone's got any questions about the Accord, I can leave you with a name and a contact. I'm happy to answer any questions. If I can, I will. If I can't, I'll refer you to my staff back at VACCHO. But thank you for listening, and I really was interested in the training that you spoke about. So thank you very much.